It was more of a book for the general public than a lot of my academic writing. I ended up on the Stephen Colbert Report. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for a month, so it got some attention. Some of it bad attention, some of it good attention. The Colbert Report was very interesting because now more people know me from that, I think, than from all my scientific work. And one of the things that I tried to show in that book was that a lot of our greatest leaders had either depression or bipolar disorder. And I'm trying to show that partly to get at the problem of stigma, which, as a previous speaker brought up, is a major problem in our society. And to me, it became even more clear how much of a problem it was when so many of the mainstream intellectuals in places like the New York Times were so angry about these ideas. You can read about it if you like, it's all online. But also I was interested in it because, just as a mere historical fact, I think the presence of depression and bipolar disorder obviously poses some problems, but it also has some benefits for leaders, and that's what I wrote about. But the treatment of them also can pose problems, potentially, as well as benefits. And the problem in the case of amphetamines can be, as I'll show you, that they can cause mania. And Hitler, for instance, got intravenous amphetamines from 1937 on a daily basis until the day he died. Before that, he had bipolar disorder, as I tried to show in the book, with primary source documentation. But he functioned quite differently. Churchill, on the other hand, had very severe depression, was very suicidal, and amphetamines probably helped him in terms of keeping him alive. So you can see both harm and benefit in the way they were used. Anyway, the point is that amphetamines have been around for a very long time. And around the 1960s in the United States, President Kennedy passed a law requiring proof of efficacy before a drug got on the market. Well, what about all the drugs that were on the market before the 1960s? You know, the pharmacopoeia was 10 times bigger, 100 times bigger, 100 years ago than it is now. We had many more drugs in treatment because everyone believes everything works. So what they did in the 60s, after Kennedy's law was passed, into the 70s, is that they went the FDA basically had these committees come together, which painstakingly went through drug by drug by drug and looked at the evidence for the efficacy and tried to decide which ones should stay on the market and which ones should come off. Tens of thousands of drugs were removed from the US market back then. Most of us don't know this because it maybe happened just before, or a good deal of time before we all came on the scene. But there was a huge change that happened in the 60s and 70s. But so the majority of drugs got taken off the market. Amphetamines stayed. Why did they stay? Not because there were randomized clinical trials that showed they were safe and effective, because there wasn't. But just because they'd been around for 30 years, they were the first class of antidepressant, and they'd been widely used, and people felt comfortable with them. Since there was a clinical sense that they were safe and effective, they were left on the market. But you should ask the question today, if amphetamines were a completely new drug class, would the FDA approve it? I'll show you some data to suggest that I think that there'd be some data about whether it could be approvable. Now, another question as we get into this is methylphenidate and amphetamine. This often comes up, Ritalin. People often say, well, I keep using the phrase amphetamine, and some people in their mind might continually be accepting methylphenidate from this discussion. But if you go to Goodman and Gilman's textbook of pharmacology, methylphenidate is listed among amphetamines. It's called structurally related to amphetamines, very similar in pharmacological properties to amphetamines. The only real difference is that besides dopamine agonism, which is what all amphetamines do, methylphenidate also gives you some noradrenergic agonism. But it is really not all that different, but basically the same as an amphetamine. So everything I say has to do with that as well. This to give you a sense of how similar it is structurally to amphetamines. So on the top of this slide, you have dopamine and norepinephrine, where the variations on that one hydrogen or hydroxy ion would be. Then you got methylphenidate below it. You can see, not all that different, just you have a ring added. And then you got amphetamine below that, which is not all that different. So let's not make methylphenidate seem like, it's black and amphetamines are white. It's extremely dark gray and amphetamines are black. They're very similar. Now, I mentioned that amphetamines work in normal people. This should be pretty obvious to you. Most drugs of abuse work in normal people. That's why they're abused. About 10% at least of college students use amphetamines. About 3% are prescribed. So they share them with their friends about 3 times over, or they sell them. street market value, methamphetamine and other variants of amphetamine are clearly street drugs. That should not be a questionable statement, but just to prove the point, there are various studies like this, a little hard for you to read maybe, but this is a study of schizophrenia versus normal controls, and basically what you find in terms of effects on cognition with response time, delay errors, is that the schizophrenics improve, as do the normal controls. But the schizophrenics improve more when they're on amphetamines compared to normal controls. And this is, I think, a reflection of the fact that this kind of study shows you that amphetamines do not have a specific benefit in ADHD. They'll work in schizophrenia, in any scenario where there's a cognitive impairment. And you can show some improvement in reaction time, even in normal controls who get amphetamines. So just to give you the numbers, so you went from a 8-second delay reaction time improvement of 80 seconds in normal controls when they got amphetamines, and it improved